All right, so we're 2 minutes after the hour. We'll get started. So, hi again, everyone. De nouveau, si vous l'utilisez, écoutez cet appel en français, vous pouvez le faire en utilisant l'option interprétation en bas de votre écran. This call, as usual, is being recorded and will be posted in the next 2 days. And our agenda for today, we are joined by our colleagues at aidsfonds, Sheldon and Julia. Hi, both. Will be sharing with us some of the stakes and opportunities for engagement around the HIV HLM, as well as more details on what we know of the timeline for the meeting. We'll also joined by Priscilla Amanado, who is the co-chair of a multi-stakeholder task force. Sorry, took a second. We'll be adding a few remarks on the work of the task force. After that, we'll be passing on the floor to Tag. We'll be talking about the TB treatment pipeline ahead of GCA. It's a bit of a follow-up on some of the discussions we had around the HIV prevention and treatment pipeline, the TB testing pipeline, and the malaria treatment a month ago now. So I just want to provide a little bit of context around the HIV HLM, sort of frame this conversation. I feel like because a lot of the official discussions at the UN level have been somewhat delayed, it's not yet been the same sort of momentum we've seen in previous HLMs. And so I think it's useful here to remind each other of why is it that these meetings are important. So the first one is that we're in a very specific moment in the global HIV response. We have a sudden massive withdrawal of international funding, you will all know and have noticed. And this is being paired with an ongoing legal backslide. It's not a new phenomenon, but we've seen large countries, in particular Senegal most recently, that have been passing sweeping anti-homosexuality laws that are really making the response a lot more complicated beyond the other problems that come with this kind of wide criminalization. We also see a weakening of a global consensus on global health generally, and that to an extent applies to the HIV epidemic as well. And all of that is happening at the same time as we see a very busy innovation pipeline, which has seen potential game changer being starting to scale up at least. And that we're thinking in particular of long-acting lenacapavir, but there's a number of others. And so we're at a moment where we both have new tools that are truly revolutionary and that are also being scaled up in a context where we see a lot of technological advancements. I'm very AI skeptic, but there's a lot of people who believe that there's a lot that can be done with AI around health and the health response and removing barriers to access, etc. So in that context, where we have all of these new tools, we find ourselves at the same time where we have less financing and a general change of mood globally around how we approach global health. That specific HLM, I think, is especially important in that regard, because on the one hand, it'd be an opportunity to take the pulse of a commitment of the international community to ending the HIV epidemic. 2030 is around the corner. I don't think I'm breaking any news saying that it's not just that we're not on track towards ending the epidemic as a threat to human life, as was the plan for 2030, but we just won't get there. There's no clear realistic pathway. There was not a couple of years ago. There's even less now. But even if we miss that goal, it still appears that we are on a good trajectory. We still see deaths going down. We don't have a good sense of what has happened last year after the US cuts to new infections. So when the data will come out, we'll get a sense of the scale of the damage. But in all of that context, understanding are countries still committed to ending the epidemic, even if it takes more time, if the timeline takes us past 2030, is really important. And will also provide us with strategic scaffolding to rapidly changing global response. What I mean by that is that a number of key funders are withdrawing from global health, and a lot of responsibilities are already falling or are about to fall to countries and onto domestic financing. We see in particular the accelerated transition that is being put in place by the Global Fund. And that is a major transition. And understand having a clear strategic direction in terms of where do we want to go and how do we go there is particularly important at this moment. So this is a bit of context. Now I'm giving the floor to Julia and Shannon. I don't know which order you want to speak. I have your slides, but if you want to project them, it always makes things easier in terms of timing. That's okay by me. So I'll stop sharing, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much, Quentin. I'm happy to share my slides, obviously. It's really great to speak to you all today because I think, as Quentin alluded, because of the late start for preparing for this high-level meeting, it's actually been really difficult for communities and civil society to mobilize. And Peter and Priscilla, who are both on this call and doing a hero's amount of work on organizing the multi-stakeholder hearing and civil society more broadly. We'll be able to tell you a little bit more about that. But we wanted to have this opportunity to speak to you all about what's happening, about some of the political dynamics that are in play, and talk about what we can do as a community to try and ensure a successful outcome when the odds really are stacked against us. So the last time we had a high-level meeting, it was in 2021, and we got started in February with a modalities resolution and a really clear path forward for negotiating the political declaration. And even then, the process was very politically fraught. The political declaration ended up getting voted on, and it was challenging. This year, we've basically got 2 months to get ourselves organized for a successful outcome at a moment when the bottom has fallen out of funding, as Quentin said, when it's going to be really difficult for communities and folks to get to New York to try to influence the process. And at a moment where the politics are absolutely the most fraught that I've ever seen them at the international level, which is saying something. So our process, as we have laid out here, is it's a very short timeline. Tomorrow, the Multi-Stakeholder Taskforce is holding a civil society global consultation on the high-level meeting, which will be an important opportunity for folks to weigh in on the priorities that they're putting together that's supposed to be representative of the broad community. On May 14th, which is next Thursday, there will be a multi-stakeholder hearing. Participation for that is currently being worked out by the Multi-Stakeholder Task Force, and I'm sure that Priscilla and Peter can say a little bit more about that. But that's the key opportunity for us to speak to member states before they start negotiating the political declaration about what our priorities are as a community. And it's been really pivotal in the past in getting communities and community voices in front of member states who are often very insulated in their bubbles in New York and don't have much grounding in the HIV response. The day after, we expect the release of the zero draft of the political declaration. And that is at the point where the political negotiations really kick off. They will release with that zero draft a timeline for informal negotiations. And informal negotiations will continue throughout, I would say, it's probably starting the end of May, about a week after the zero draft comes out, and probably will take place fairly consistently throughout June, with the goal of getting to a political declaration by the high-level meeting on June 22nd and June 23rd. It's not clear that we'll get there. If we do get there, it's clear already, I think, from the outset that the political declaration will probably be not agreed by consensus. It probably will be voted on. There will be a lot of very fractious and very contentious issues. So we already saw with the adoption of the modalities resolution, for example, a group of countries, about 12 countries, really spearheading attacks on key population references to key populations and broader communities. We saw a number of countries also try to restrict civil society participation in the high-level meeting and try to claw back some of the ways that we've had of engaging in the process in the past. So we know that it's going to be politically fractious. There are some other issues beyond beyond key populations that I think will really come into play in these negotiations, including on things like um, gender, gender equality, sexual and reproductive health, and reproductive rights, which are things that have consistently been challenging. But beyond that, we've seen greater north-south divides in recent negotiations around things like trips and access to medicines that have been really difficult to manage and have been amplified because of the ongoing negotiations on the PABS annex to the pandemic accord. We've also seen a lot of really strong divides around development financing and tech transfer and some of the issues around that, which will come into play likely in these negotiations as well. And so the stakes are really against us at this point. I do think that if we're mobilized and if we're strong and if we're coordinating both at capitals and with missions in New York, we'll be able to get an outcome that we can live with. And I think, one of the clear messages that we need to give is if we know that the outcome is going to be probably voted on, and if some of the key things that are priorities for us as communities are going to be voted on, then trying to negotiate too much and with the goal of consensus resulting in watering down key things that are likely to be contested anyway. I think one of the messages we need to give to member states is that they take a really strong stance on some of these key issues. So one of the things that we've done.
Sorry, Shannon, can you speak slightly closer to the mic? Our interpreter struggles a little bit to hear you. Apologies.
Okay. So I just said that if we do get into a situation where the outcome is going to be voted on anyway, it would be really important to send a message to member states who are supportive of some of our key priorities, not to compromise too much in advance with the goal of getting to consensus if some of these key things are going to be contested. So one of the things that we have done to prepare for this is put together a priorities declaration. This is not in competition with the work that the Multi-Stakeholder Taskforce is doing. But we put it together because we know that governments were forming their positions already, and that the drafting of the zero draft is happening as we speak. And we wanted to be able to influence that process. So I'm handing it over now to Julia to walk us through the priorities document that we have all put together and which I shared with you all last week.
Thanks, Shannon. So as Shannon mentioned, you should have received the priorities document. It's also here. I've also put it in the chat. So really you have it many ways. And maybe just to take a moment to add on to what Shannon said about why we felt that the priorities document was a necessity. As Shannon mentioned, we know that even before the zero draft starts to be written by the co-chairs, governments are already starting to identify their own red lines and their own priorities within the negotiations. And so we wanted to be able to message to governments a very broad civil society priorities document, set of priorities, as early as we could, so that these could influence the government positions early and strongly. We, of course, support the Multi-Stakeholder Taskforce process, and we've shared these priorities with them to be included in the civil society document that comes out. And we've also, of course, shared this with UN AIDS, and we will soon be sharing with the co-chairs so that they can include it in the zero drafting process. So what exactly are the priorities and how did they come together? We worked with a broad group of civil society representing key populations, people living with HIV, women and girls, youth, and as well as with folks in the sciences. And the intent here was to figure out what are the broad issues that we really feel the political declaration needs to affirm, in addition to affirming the goals and targets of the global AIDS strategy that we know must kind of direct the next years in the HIV response. So you can see the first 6 of our 12 priorities. Of course, we try to keep things as streamlined as possible, but there is so much to be included because HIV is a disease that impacts so many different areas of the lifespan and is also impacted by so many different things like NCDs, NTDs, etc. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't leave anything out. So these first 6 are on the screen. Perhaps I won't read them out directly to you because you all can of course see them yourself, but I'm not sure. Shannon, do we have the second 6 as well?
Yeah.
If not, I can just So maybe we can move on to the second 6. And as you all take a look at that, I'll just say what we were trying to do here was really ensuring that no community was left behind, whether that community is a key population, whether they're young women and girls, whether they're people in humanitarian crises, whether they're children and youth. So to make sure that the political declaration really speaks to the broad needs of communities impacted by HIV. And I'll say one last thing before stopping and handing it over to Q&A or to Priscilla if you want to add anything about the role and the process of the Multi-Stakeholder Taskforce. We, as Shannon said, we know this is going to be a struggle to get a strong political declaration. And our goal is to have the zero draft be as strong and rights affirming and evidence-based as possible, because we know that countries will try and negotiate things out of it. And so the sort of strategy here is do not cede any ground preemptively, so that when ground is ceded, because it eventually inevitably will be, we're starting from the strongest position we can. So I think I will stop there and just make a final plug that many of you on the call have already endorsed this priorities declaration. Thank you very much. We are very much still accepting endorsements, and the more civil society we have signing on to this, the stronger our voice in front of the co-chairs, and the more likely we get these priorities into the zero draft of the political declaration. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Julian. Thanks a lot, Shannon. Shannon, do you want to add something?
I just put this together, but I think it would be great to hear from Priscilla and Peter because a lot of this speaks to the work that they're doing.
Exactly. So as we before we move to the question and answers, Priscilla and Peter, if you want to add anything to what was discussed or tell us more about what the Multi-Stakeholder Task Force has been doing or is about to do, would be wonderful.
Uh, Thank you very much. All has been covered, but the only thing I would like to add is that during the advocacy week, we would really appreciate as much support as we can get from advocates who would be in New York, because not many of the MSTF would be in New York, and we would like to know who would be there to support the different advocacy events that would be taking place. So I'm sure at the global consultation tomorrow, probably we will learn more on how to engage effectively at the advocacy week. Thank you.
Thanks, Priscilla. Peter, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, not really. I think the recommendations that you come up with are really appreciated. So thanks so much for doing that. We are all working together on this. I just posted the list of countries in the chat function that were against the definition of key populations, and some of you might know that I did write a little piece on that UN meeting that took place to talk about the modalities. I think it's really important to focus on the countries and what positions they have. If you want to get in contact with your own government, then this list of countries is extremely important because they might try to sort of influence them and get in contact to them. And this would be a sort of a broader initiative. We heard about the week of action in New York, but my wish would be that this would be some to some extent an international movement, because we have to do our homework as well, and not everybody from us lives in New York or is in New York next week. So thanks so much for the work that you're doing, and Priscilla, thanks so much for the work that you do, because you do it's just amazing. So thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Peter, and thanks a lot, Priscilla. So I wanted to open it for a few minutes on the for any questions. There's already 2 questions in the chat. Please, anyone else, if you want to raise your hand. And so 2 questions in the chat for whoever wants to take them among the 4 of you. First one is, do you have any more details on what will be going on during the Advocacy Week? Can we share events over with MS reps in New York? Diplomatic, I don't know what MS stands for. Sorry, but you can type it in the chat. So that's the first question. And the second one is, how does this HLM relate with the future of UNAIDS? So what is, sorry, member state. Sorry, Pernille, if I was me being dumb. So who wants to take which one first? I see Shannon moving around. You want to get started? Oh, hello. Oh, no.
I'm muted. So I defer to Priscilla to talk about the Advocacy Week, because the Multi-Stakeholder Taskforce has been organizing that. But how does this relate to the future of UNAIDS? You know, one of the things that was really under contention during the negotiation of the modalities resolution was this question of dates. And there were some countries that were pushing to have it move back to December, primarily because of concerns around civil society participation, actually, but not only. And there were some other member states that were pushing to have it in June, and UNAIDS itself was really pushing to have it in June. And one of the reasons I understand that UNAIDS was really pushing to have it in June was so that they had, there was a global sort of mandate, ongoing mandate for the HIV response from the UN before they went into the conversations the following week around the sunset of UNAIDS. So I think that they see this as somehow connected to their future, but perhaps there are others who have more insight into how it relates, because governments have very different opinions about the link between this high-level meeting and the future of UNAIDS.
Anyone else wants to add anything on the link with the future of UNAIDS? It's also very opaque to me. Please go ahead.
I'll just come in briefly on that point. And you all, I'm sure, know perhaps better than I do that the UN80 process is an ongoing parallel process to the HIV HLM. But UNAIDS is holding a first multi-stakeholder consultation on the integration of UNAIDS functions into the UN system next week. I believe it's on the 12th. I put in the chat the link to register. Registration is open through the 8th. I think this is going to be a key space to learn more, because up until now, we've not even heard sort of which of the priorities, which of the functions that UNAIDS holds are being prioritized for transition to other UN entities. And so I would really encourage all of us to attend, and also all of us to sort of come together with our own organizations or between organizations to identify which UNAIDS functions we believe are the most vital and where we think they should sit within the UN, because at least as far as, or within the UN or beyond the UN, because as far as I've seen to date, there hasn't been a broad civil society recommendation around this, and it's a process that's moving quite quickly. And if we're able to speak sort of collectively and strongly, I think we'll have a much better chance of ensuring that what we feel is most important of UNAIDS can continue to survive beyond the end of UNAIDS as an entity.
Thanks a lot, Julia. Peter, do you want to take the floor?
Yeah, we just had yesterday a meeting with UNAIDS here in Germany, and I think the most important sort of part is the ECOSOC status that UNAIDS has, so the integration of civil society into the decision-making processes. So this might be a gun when UNAIDS disappears. So this seems to me to be the most important part. And then, of course, for global fund related work for me always has been the data collection that is done by UNAIDS. And if this goes to WHO, which is very likely, nobody can secure that they are really interested and push for aggregated data that we all need in order to, that the global fund needs in order to come up with tailored programs. So all of this will be lost because WHO won't have the urge, the power to sort of push for that. This power had UNAIDS and WHO won't have it. So this is my strong belief. So we have to be very careful on how this process goes. So please participate in the meeting next week. We came up with a position on UNAIDS and the Global Fund and how it works together. If you are interested, I can forward this to you. But I think the upcoming weeks are extremely important. And of course, the UN High-level meeting itself is one of the steps towards the future developments. And I completely understand that UNAs did want to have this meeting in June and not in December or in November, where we have a new General Secretary for the UN and all of these developments where nobody knows what's happening next. So thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I see, Julia, that you've addressed a question regarding the 12 priorities. So I just wanted to briefly give the floor to Priscilla. If you want to tell us a bit more about what the Advocacy Week is going to be and how can it be amplified and how can it be pushed towards member states.
The MSCF is going to meet on Thursday as well to finalize plans for that. But essentially, what we have in mind is to engage uh, the PMs per region, looking at EU, LAC, Asia Pacific, and so on, particularly looking at bilaterals with them. Specifically for countries who we've seen either abstaining from the voting process or supporting Russia's position, because it's very critical we engage them before the HLM starts. And so that's the general idea. Aside that, because we don't know the manpower that would be on the ground, like how many people would be specifically on the ground in New York, it's hard to plan. Sorry, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, my network is. But yeah, so because we are still unaware about the number of people or the number of advocates who would be in New York, it's still something we have to put.
Well, I think she dropped off. So I'll ask her to put in her reflections in writing after she's able to join back. I don't see any
Yeah.
other.
She's back.
Oh, hi again, Priscilla.
Yes, sorry. So just to conclude, it's very important that if you're going to be in New York, please do send us an email to the MSCF group, indicating that you will be there, and possibly the week before the HLM starts, you will be there as well, so we can engage you for the advocacy week. We will share details of the exact plans for the next coming weeks and how people can engage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. All right, so I don't see any other hands up, and if you have additional questions, do put them in the chat. But in the meantime, I want to move on to our next agenda item, which is a look at the TB treatment pipeline. We are joined by Lindsay. Lindsay, I know you couldn't get online before half an hour, so just checking that you are indeed here and that we can hear you.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. Yes, we can hear you. Great. Thanks. So just before giving you the floor, I wanted to give again like a little bit of context on why we wanted to have this conversation. This cycle, by that I mean this funding cycle for a global fund mostly, innovation is talked about in a very specific way. People talk about innovation as a way to counteract funding cuts. So not so much as a way to accelerate the end of the epidemics, as as a way that we've talked about innovation for a long time, but specifically in the context of shrinking funding, the idea is that we will be able to maintain impact through innovation. And so because we're going to have a lot of difficult decisions at the country level throughout GC8 and the grant preparation processes, we think it's really important to reflect about the right size of innovation because it's easy to buy into this idea that we just need, shiny new toys and that will solve our problems this way. So there are pitfalls both ways. We can underestimate how much a tool is going to have an impact and under budget for it and miss out on potential impact. We can also overestimate and overinvest into tools that are not able to do miracles by themselves. So we talked last month about TB diagnostics, HIV treatment prevention, malaria treatment, and today we wanted to get a chance to go into to cover TB treatment. And so I wanted to give the floor to Lindsay. I'll remove my slides so you can share yours.
Okay, share my slides. Let me know if you can see them.
Yep.
Okay, I'm just waiting for my computer to catch up. It's loading. Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, thanks so much, Quentin. And I'm really happy to talk about the TB treatment pipeline, and especially to help give some insights that might be helpful for the folks that are kind of in the throes of GC8 planning and those discussions. So I thought it would be helpful to just start with a slide that overviews kind of the full menu of treatment regimens that are currently recommended by the World Health Organization. And you could see here they're divided by indication. So at the top, we have 3 regimens for drug-sensitive TB. We have the standard 6-month regimen that we've had for the last 40 years, right? Isoniazid, rifampin, pyrazinamide, ethambutol, everyone's familiar with that. But we also have 2 4-month regimens. These are shorter regimens that have come out in the last few years. So the first one, number 2, is specifically for children with non-severe TB. It's actually the same regimen as the 6-month regimen. You just cut off the last 2 months of treatment. And then,
Wait, Lindsay, sorry, I have to interrupt you. We don't see the slides are not moving. We're only seeing your whole presentation. We're not actually seeing the presentation mode.
oh, you don't see presentation mode.
No, we see your the usual PowerPoint look.
Okay. Let me see if I can swap the display because I see the presentation on my side.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Or if you just scroll around the tabs that work as well.
Okay, hold on one second. Sorry.
Yay.
Okay, so you're just seeing the full PowerPoint window that has like the thumbnails on the left. Okay.
But at least we see the right slide now.
Okay, maybe I'll just make that extra big since I don't know how to, I'm sorry, I don't know how to switch the display. Hopefully that this is okay.
Yay.
Can you see that all right?
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Okay.
Sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. My apologies for the tech issue. Okay, so the other shorter regimen for drug-sensitive TB is a 4-month regimen that's actually been recommended since 2022, but has not been widely taken up. This is a regimen that swaps in rifapentine for rifampicin and moxifloxacin for ethambutol, and it's just 4 months. And that's for adults and adolescents, and we'll come back to that in a second. For drug-resistant TB, we have a series of shorter regimens ranging from 6 to 9 to 11 months. We have the 6-month BPAL-M regimen. That's the bedaquiline and pretomanid-based regimen that should be familiar to everyone. We have the beat tuberculosis regimen, which is similar to the BPAL-M regimen, except for it swaps in delaminid for pretomanid. and a few other drugs. We have the 9-month NTB regimens, which similarly are bedaquiline based. And then we have this kind of standardized 9 to 11-month all oral regimen that's a little bit older that countries are very familiar with. And I'll get into in a second on the next slide kind of how Global Fund has indicated they would prefer countries kind of prioritize these regimens in GC8. But before that, finally, for pre-XDR, XDR TB, this is TB that's resistant to the fluoroquinolones and or bedaquiline. We have the BPAL regimen. That's the same regimen recommended for drug-resistant TB. You just drop off the fluoroquinolone if there's resistance. And then similarly, the beat tuberculosis regimen, where there's modifications related to the fluoroquinolone as well. And then finally, for people who have kind of complicated forms of resistance, including bedaquiline resistance, they are typically being treated with 18 to 20-month individualized regimens. So this is just the full suite of what's recommended by the WHO. But within GC8 and within country programs, there is some preference and suggestions for how to prioritize. So starting with drug-resistant TB, in the Global Fund prioritization guidance for GC8, they're very clear and say to prioritize BPAL-M. However, there are certain populations that are not currently eligible for treatment with this regimen because there are some data gaps for pratomatid, specifically in children and pregnant women. And so for populations that are not eligible for BPAL-M, they say to prioritize the beat tuberculosis regimen. And that regimen the composition is listed here. You could see it's similar to BPAL-M, except for, again, you see a D, delaminid, where pratomatid would otherwise be. We see a second L, that's for levofloxacin instead of moxifloxacin. It's just another fluoroquinolone, drugs in the same class. And then the C is for clofazimine. So that's the regimen, that's the priority according to the Global Fund guidance for people who can't benefit from access to BPAL-M. And then finally, there is another note in the guidance that says for people who have these complicated forms of drug resistance, including bedaquiline resistance, to try to limit the use of injection-based regimens. So try to compose an effective all-oral regimen if that's possible. And here you can see how these different regimens that are recommended are priced, and you could see kind of the rationale for Global Fund's prioritization in terms of, choosing the regimens that are kind of the shortest, that have good efficacy, that are affordable. And so you could see that here. For drug-sensitive TB, the Global Fund prioritization guidance for GC8 does say to prioritize the 4-month regimen specific to children with non-severe disease. Otherwise, they say for everyone else to prioritize the 6-month regimen we've had for the last 40 years, given its low cost and the pill burden. And the reason they specify that specifically is it's in relation to the cost and the pill burden of the other drug-sensitive TB regimen that's recommended by WHO, this 4-month rifapentine and moxifloxacin containing regimen. And so within the guidance document, Global Fund says, they leave room for this regimen, but they create some kind of limitations or guardrails. They say that use of the HPMZ or the 4-month rifapentine and moxifloxacin containing regimen should be specific for populations where programs where program needs justify additional costs. So that might be specific populations who really could benefit from this shorter regimen, people who are not available to complete treatment within the 6-month period or at risk for not completing for other reasons. The pill burden issue is a legacy issue. This regimen was introduced in 2022. There were not fixed dose combinations. There haven't been fixed dose combinations of the rifapentine and moxifloxacin containing regimen until recently. So they were individual kind of tablets. It resulted in a very high pill burden from 6 to 9 pills per day versus what people are used to with the standard HRZE regimen, which is just 4 pills. However, excitingly, there are finally new fixed dose combinations for this regimen that are undergoing Global Fund expert review panel review right now, and that will hopefully be available later this year. And that'll actually bring the pill burden down to equivalent to that of the 6-month regimen, just 4 pills per day. So that's kind of taking down one barrier for this regimen, which is great. A barrier that still remains and is for consideration, I think, especially in GC8, where programs are budgeting with smaller budgets from the Global Fund this time around. The price of the rifapentine and moxifloxacin containing regimen is about 3 times what the 6-month regimen, the drugs cost. So $120 per treatment course versus $43 per treatment course. However, there is modeling that suggests even at this higher price, the regimen is cost effective. So modeling specifically done in the context of South Africa and the Philippines, basically while the cost of the medicines is higher, the duration of treatment is shorter. And so there are expected savings in areas not specific to the drug costs. Okay, so I just wanted to start by kind of giving an orientation to like what regimens are currently recommended, how Global Fund is suggesting those be prioritized in GC8, and now I'm gonna kind of move into what is in development for TB. So what are the new drugs kind of coming down the pipeline for treatment of TB? So to orient you to this table, it's organized, or the drugs are grouped by the way they attack the TB bacteria. So the target, whether that's how the bacteria makes energy, how it builds its cell wall, how it makes protein or DNA. So they're grouped according to target. And then moving from left to right, we have the name of the drug, the class of the drug, the mechanism of action, the sponsor, and the phase of development that it's in. And we won't go through each of these one by one here in the table. I think the things to highlight is that there are 22 new drugs that are in clinical development, meaning they're in clinical trials being tested currently in humans. And I've highlighted some categories here to keep in mind. So in purple, you can see I've highlighted 3 drugs that are all diraquinolones. That's the drug class, and that's the same drug class as bedaquiline. So the idea for these 3 drugs that are being developed is that they may be advantaged alternatives to bedaquiline. Bedaquiline has some side effects, like its effect on the heart that can increase or prolong the QT interval and affect the heart's rhythm. The thinking here is that these drugs will have less of an effect on the heart. There'll be less of that kind of safety concern. And also for some of them, there is early data that shows they might be able to treat some forms of TB that are currently showing resistance to bedaquiline. So the idea is these drugs would ideally in the future replace bedaquiline because they're more effective and potentially have a better safety profile. The same is true if you look at the drugs that are highlighted in pink. These are all oxazolidinones. That's the same drug class as linezolid. So linezolid has a lot of complicated side effects. We know it causes peripheral neuropathy or nerve pain in your hands and feet. It can cause anemia, but it's a very effective drug. And so the idea behind bringing forward these kind of cousins of linezolid or next generation versions of linezolid is that you can hopefully replace it with a version of the drug that is just as effective or more effective, but doesn't have has a better safety profile and doesn't have these kind of challenging side effects. And then in blue, we have a category of drugs that have the same mechanism of action. These are called DPRE1 inhibitors. These are kind of first-in-class drugs, the furthest along of which is sponsored by Otsuka, called quapodepostat. We'll come back to that one. But this is kind of a new way of attacking the TB bacteria. And so I've highlighted kind of that category of drugs there because they work the same way. So all of these are kind of moving their way through the pipeline. And on the next slide, this is just maybe a little bit easier on the eyes in terms of a way to visualize where each of the drugs are in development. So on the left side, you have things that are earlier in development in phase 1, meaning they're being tested mostly in like healthy volunteers. And then as you work your way to the right side of the slide, you have drugs further along in phase 2 and 3 that are being tested in much bigger trials with larger sample sizes, more people that are receiving the drugs. I've circled here the drugs that are going to be moving into phase 3 or are already in phase 3 over the course of like the GC8 window. So there is a long-acting formulation of bedaquiline that just is completing a phase 1 trial. It will go straight into phase 3 for TB preventive treatment is the indication. So TPT. That trial is likely to begin during GC8, but will not produce results, I think, until after GC8. So just to flag, that's still a little bit early. And then there are the quabadepistat drug that I mentioned is sponsored by Otsuka is already in phase 3. They had their, I think, first patient enrolled towards the end of last year. And then finally, this TBA J876 or sorfequilin, as it's now being called, is sponsored by the TB Alliance, and that is getting ready to move into phase 3. That is the kind of cousin of bedaquiline, right? That we think might be able to treat some resistant forms and maybe has a better safety profile. So what is the landscape of the clinical trials? How are these drugs kind of being combined into regimens and being taken forward in that way? So for the research agenda for drug-sensitive TB, what we see is a lot of iterating on the regimens that are currently recommended by the WHO. So it's an attempt to use the HRZE or HPMZ regimens and adjust them to try to get to a shorter or safer treatment regimen. And so the goal of the series of trials that are being conducted specifically in populations that have drug-sensitive TB are to shorten treatment regimens. They want to get from 2 to 4 months by either swapping in high-dose rifampicin for rifapentine, and I put in kind of parentheses examples of the trials that are using these different strategies for treatment shortening. So they're either swapping in high-dose rifampicin for rifapentine, they're altering the dose of rifapentine or moxifloxacin. In some cases, they're introducing second-line drugs into first-line treatment, so bringing bedaquiline and moxifloxacin and even delamanid into first-line treatment, or they're deploying what's called a stratified medicine approach to treatment duration. So basically tailoring the duration of treatment based on risk factors for a poor treatment outcome, like severity of disease. There are also kind of a series of trials or concepts in development that are more focused on improving the safety and tolerability of treatment regimens for drug-sensitive TB. So acknowledging that even the regimen we've had for the last 40 years has a lot of difficult side effects, from rash to nausea to liver toxicity. And so is there a way to modify these regimens to improve their safety and tolerability by replacing or removing the drugs that drive those difficult side effects and the treatment interruptions that are related to them, even if that means potentially extending treatment duration? So you're trading duration, you're getting a longer treatment, but maybe it's more tolerable and safer. So there's kind of an emerging space in the field where clinical trialists are putting together concepts and for trials that take this approach. And then finally, for drug-sensitive TB trials, there's some unfinished business. So basically making sure that we're filling data caps for kids and pregnant women and persons so that they can benefit from access to the full suite of regimens WHO recommends, including the 4-month rifapentine and moxifloxacin-containing regimen. For pan-susceptible TB, or what are referred to as pan-TB trials, this maybe is a concept you've heard before. The idea is that these regimens for pan-TB don't include rifampicin or isoniazid. So that means that they could be used to treat all forms of TB currently. You wouldn't have, you could treat people who have drug-sensitive TB, people who have susceptibility to rifampicin and isoniazid, as well as people who are resistant to rifampicin and isoniazid, because those two drugs are not a part of these regimens. So this is called pan-TB is what it's called. And all of these trials are really in middle development. They're currently in phase 2, not ready for prime time, but this is where we see a lot of the new drugs that I highlighted on that table being introduced into regimens for TB. So these trials are focused on advancing the new drugs in different combinations. Their goal is similarly to shorten treatment to 2 to 4 months. And we see them using a bedaquiline and delamanid or pratomanid backbone, and then swapping in the new drugs with new mechanisms of action, like the DPRE1 inhibitors, like quabadepistat, the Otsuka drug, or swapping in those advantaged alternatives to existing drugs, the cousins of linazolid or the cousins of bedaquiline. And I put at the bottom some examples of these types of trials. And again, these are all in phase 2. None of these are phase 3. And it's unlikely, I think, that any of them will be ready for implementation in the GC8 window, but it's something to keep an eye on. And then finally, we have drug-resistant TB. The trial landscape here is focused on treatment shortening, so that's a theme, right? But also improving safety and tolerability and optimizing the duration of existing regimens. And so the different approaches that we see be taken here are swapping in new drugs. So the phase 3 trial of Otsuka's new compound, quabadepistat, is called Quantum TB. And basically what they've done is they've taken the B-PAL-M regimen and they said, okay, linezolid is a toxic drug with difficult side effects in this regimen. So what if we swap in quabadepistat for linezolid? Can we improve the safety of the regimen and can we make it shorter? So that is kind of how that new drug is entering phase 3. And they are expected, I think, to have the trial completed within the GC8 window. So according to their clinicaltrials.gov entry, I think they're projecting that the estimated study completion will be in early 2028, which falls within the window. So this is something to keep an eye on. We might have this new drug in the GC8 window, depending on the outcome of the phase 3 trial and what happens with regulatory review of it. Then there's also approaches that are introducing the stratified medicine approach to drug-resistant TB treatment. So there's a trial called PRISM TB, which again takes the B-PAL-M regimen, right? But it says for people who have less severe TB or fewer risk factors for a poor treatment outcome, can we shorten treatment for them? And then for people who have more severe disease or other risk factors for poor treatment outcome, can we give them a longer treatment? And does this stratified strategy improve overall outcomes for people with drug-resistant TB? For bedaquiline-resistant TB, or these more complicated forms of resistance, there are kind of two approaches. This is an area where there's definitely a need for more science and more attention. But there's one trial looking at using existing drugs. So they basically start with B-PAL-L, which is the B-PAL-M regimen, just with levofloxacin instead of moxifloxacin, right? And then depending on the person's individual kind of drug resistance, so what drugs they're resistant to or susceptible to, they swap in group B and C drugs until they have a regimen of 5 likely effective drugs. So this is one approach. This trial is on open and ongoing. And then the other approach is really combining multiple new drugs. And this is a trial sponsored by the EDTCP called XDR-TB. So it's introducing drugs like ganfebrol, like delpazolid, some of the new drugs we talked about earlier, combining multiple new drugs into a regimen to try to take on XDR-TB. So that's the landscape of how we see these drugs being kind of combined and the different strategies and approaches that are being investigated to try to improve treatment by either making it shorter or making it safer and more tolerable, or ideally both. But within the GC8 window, I think we're in a stage of kind of transition in the pipeline. We have this menu of all of these regimens that are recommended by WHO, including the short course 4-month regimen with rifapentine. We have B-PAL-M. We have the Beat TB regimen. So we have, the fruits of the last kind of 2 decades of research and development. And now, within this next window, I think we're going to start to see some of these new drugs move their way through the pipeline. But in terms of what you might be writing into GC8, I think the focus is really on what the WHO currently recommends, and maybe in the middle of the window, we might have another, new option for drug-resistant TB, but that's still to be seen. I put on the last slide, and hopefully Quentin can circulate these so that you could just easily click on the links, a couple of what I think are helpful resources. So the series of TAG activist guides that really are kind of a reference point for the regimens the WHO recommends. It's meant to break down these regimens, what they cost, what the barriers are, and things to watch out for. There's also a series of community treatment resources related to drug-resistant TB, a cheat sheet that has all the regimens in one place, broken out by pill burden, populations that they're indicated in. So that's helpful to have in your pocket. The actual TB treatment pipeline report, where if you want to look up any of the trials that were mentioned in the parentheticals, they're all included there. I wanted to flag, we have a new fact sheet that is coming out soon to support advocacy for the 4-month rifapentine and moxifloxacin containing regimen in GC8, since we do see that there's going to be new fixed dose combinations coming online this year. So that could be one area for introducing innovation. And then another fact sheet specifically for GC8, looking at a new class of diagnostic tests that my colleague Teju developed, these new near point of care tests that might be useful. And also a fact sheet that was developed by the folks at the Georgetown Center for Global Health Politics and Policy, what we want in GC8, that is kind of a comprehensive list of things based on the Global Fund prioritization guidance. And then, of course, the Global Fund prioritization guidance for TB itself there, so that you can see kind of the language they've used and how they've prioritized things. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lindsay. So we had a question in the chat already, and I'll give people just a minute to raise their hands if you have additional ones around how that, like whether the GDF considers and uses recommendations from the expert review panel of the Global Fund, and whether you know that. And that's a question for you, but also to anyone on the call who might have the answer.
Yeah, so as soon as something is approved by the Global Fund Expert Review Panel, the GDF then goes ahead and negotiates to put it in its catalog.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. Is there any additional questions or remarks? We only have a minute left on the call, so you can use the chat or raise your hand. Once, twice. All right. Then while people are deciding whether they do or do not want to follow up with questions, thank you very much, Lindsay, for a really informative presentation. I'm always read all of the pipeline reports from TAG very closely, so this was a bit of a treat for me. Thanks a lot. So before I close the call, I just wanted to share with everyone that we will be having a town hall in Geneva on the 21st of May in person on the Global Health Campus with the Global Fund leadership. It will be either Françoise or Diane from the resource mobilization team. So if you want to join us, you will need to register in advance. So please use this or the link that I'm posting in the chat to let us know that you're coming, because it's inside of a Global Health Campus. You'll need to be registered and put on the list if you wanna come in. For those of you that have already registered through various links that we've been sending you a couple of days, you can put your names back, but that's not necessary. And I want to thank all of our speakers and all of you for joining us today. We'll be back on in 2 weeks, and we'll be posting on our website the notes from the call, as well as recording and all supporting documents in the next 48 hours. Thank you all. Hope to see you all in 2 weeks, and perhaps before that in Geneva if you're there for the WHA. Thanks everyone, and have a great day. Bye bye.